The clinking of glasses and the warm, overlapping currents of conversation were the sounds Eleanor had once associated with happiness. Now, they were just noise, a carefully constructed soundtrack for a life that felt increasingly hollow. She stood near the grand fireplace in her sister-in-law's home, a smile pinned to her face like a brooch on a dress she'd been forced to wear. Across the room, her husband James was holding court, his laughter booming just a little too loudly, his gestures a little too grand. To everyone else, he was the life of the party. To Eleanor, he was a performer, and she was the unwilling audience to his one-man show. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, James's confidence had been a magnetic force, drawing her into an orbit of grand promises and intoxicating charm. He had made her feel like the only woman in the world. But over the years, that confidence had curdled into arrogance, his charm a weapon he wielded to chip away at her own self-worth. The grand promises had been replaced by subtle put-downs, whispers in the dark that she was lucky to have him, that she wouldn't survive without him. Earlier that evening, as she was getting ready, he had watched her from the doorway of their bedroom. She had chosen a simple, elegant navy dress, one she'd always felt good in. "Are you sure about that one, Elle?" he'd asked, his tone deceptively casual. "It's a bit simple, isn't it? My sister's friends are always so put together." He'd then suggested another dress, a flashier one she disliked, and she had changed, as she always did, to keep the peace. The navy dress now lay discarded on the bed, a silent testament to a battle she had lost before the war had even begun. Now, at the party, he was in his element. It was his family's gathering, his stage. Eleanor watched as his mother, a woman whose approval Eleanor had chased for a decade, laughed at one of his jokes, patting his arm affectionately. James caught Eleanor's eye from across the room and gave her a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't a smile of connection. It was a check-in, a reminder that she was being watched, that she had a role to play. The adoring, supportive wife. She took a sip of her wine, the tart liquid doing little to soothe the knot of anxiety in her stomach. The conversation around her had shifted, as it often did at these gatherings, to finances and career achievements. James's cousin was boasting about a recent promotion, and his uncle was detailing a savvy investment. Eleanor stayed quiet. Her own career, a small but successful graphic design business she ran from home, was a subject James either dismissed as a cute little hobby or ignored entirely. It was then that James decided to make his way back to her, a fresh drink in his hand. He slung an arm around her shoulders, the weight of it feeling more like an anchor than an embrace. "There she is," he announced to the small group that had formed near the fireplace. "My lovely wife, Eleanor. Quiet as a mouse, as usual." A few people offered polite, uncomfortable smiles. Eleanor felt a familiar heat rise in her cheeks. "We were just talking about bold moves," James continued, his voice slick with an impending cruelty she recognized all too well. He turned his gaze on her, a predatory glint in his eyes. "You know, Eleanor's ex-boyfriend, Liam, just opened his own restaurant. A huge risk. I heard it's doing incredibly well." Eleanor froze. Liam. She hadn't heard that name from James's lips in years. It felt like a violation, a ghost summoned from a past James had insisted she bury. "Oh, that's wonderful," said James's aunt, oblivious to the tension. James let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like breaking glass. He squeezed Eleanor's shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to hurt. "It is, isn't it? Makes you think." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air, ensuring he had everyone's full attention for his grand finale. He looked directly at Eleanor, his voice dripping with condescension as he delivered the blow. "I mean, even my ex did better." The words hung in the air, brutal and deliberate. The small circle of family members fell silent, their eyes darting between James's smug face and Eleanor's stunned one. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The laughter, the music, the clinking glasses. It all faded away, replaced by the deafening sound of her own humiliation. The silence that followed James's words was a physical thing. It pressed in on Eleanor, thick and suffocating. In that moment, she was not in a warm, festive room surrounded by family. She was on a barren stage, a single harsh spotlight pinning her in place. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the pity, the morbid curiosity, the discomfort. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a cage. She could feel the sting of tears behind her eyes, the familiar burn of shame that James was so adept at stoking. But then, something shifted. Deep within the whirlwind of humiliation, a strange and unfamiliar calm began to settle. It was a cold, hard clarity, like a shard of ice forming in the pit of her stomach. She had been here before, in this spotlight of shame, more times than she could count. She had always shrunk, made herself smaller, absorbed the blow to keep the peace. She had smiled through the pain, pretended the barbs didn't cut, and died a little inside each time. Tonight was different. The cruelty had been too public, the condescension too blatant. He hadn't just insulted her, he had tried to erase her, to define her worth solely in relation to other people. Her ex, his ex, anyone but herself. The image of the navy dress, discarded on their bed, flashed in her mind. It was a small thing, but it was everything. It was the thousand small surrenders, the constant erosion of her own identity that had led to this moment. And in that pristine, cold silence, Eleanor decided she was done surrendering. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held James's gaze, her own eyes steady for the first time in years. The flush in her cheeks was no longer from shame. It was the heat of a slow-burning, long-overdue rage. Her fingers, which had been trembling, grew firm around the delicate stem of her wine glass. She straightened her spine, a subtle shift that made her seem taller, more solid. The quiet mouse was gone. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her glass. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it commanded the attention of the entire room. The movement was fluid, graceful, and utterly defiant. A few people shifted nervously. James's smug expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was clear and resonant, cutting through the thick tension like a bell. "A toast," she said, her voice betraying no tremor. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the uncomfortable faces of James's family before landing squarely back on her husband. "James is right," she began, the words smooth as silk. "We should acknowledge success. So, here's to Liam." She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that stunned everyone, most of all James. Here's to him for having the courage to build something beautiful from the ground up, for following his passion with integrity. I will always be proud to have known someone with that kind of strength and character. The compliment, so sincere and gracefully delivered, was a strategic blow. It validated Liam's success not as a point of comparison to her, but as a standard of character, a standard James was failing to meet. She paused, letting the words settle. James's face was beginning to darken, his bravado evaporating. "And," Eleanor continued, her voice still impossibly calm, "here's to James's ex, too. I don't know her, but I'm sure she is doing wonderfully." She looked directly into her husband's eyes, the smile never leaving her face. People often flourish when they are no longer being held back, when they are finally free to grow. The implication was unmistakable, a perfectly aimed arrow that hit its mark with devastating precision. A quiet gasp came from James's sister. His mother looked as if she'd been slapped. Eleanor held her glass a little higher. The world is full of people who build and people who break, people who plant gardens and people who salt the earth. For the longest time, I thought my job was to try to grow flowers in the desert. She took a final look at James, whose face was now a mask of disbelief and fury. "I've just realized how foolish that is. You can't grow anything without light and air." She turned her back on him, addressing the silent, captive audience. "So, a final toast," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound freedom. "To finding the sun, to breathing again." With that, she took a long, slow sip of her wine, the taste no longer tart, but sweet. She lowered the glass, placed it with a soft click on the mantelpiece, and without another look at the wreckage of her husband's ego, she walked out of the room, her head held high, leaving a profound and deafening silence in her wake. The walk from the living room to the front door was the longest of Eleanor's life. It was as if she were moving through water, every step a conscious effort. She could feel the burning stare of her husband on her back, a physical pressure. She expected a hand to grab her arm, to hear his furious whisper in her ear, but nothing came. The shock she had detonated in the room had granted her a few precious seconds of a head start, and she used them. She didn't run. Her movements were calm and measured, the very picture of a woman who was simply retrieving her coat. She passed a few guests in the hallway, their faces a mixture of confusion and feigned ignorance as they averted their eyes, pretending not to have heard the emotional explosion from the other room. Eleanor offered them a serene, polite nod, a gesture so incongruous with the situation that it only added to their bewilderment. Her composure was her armor. She reached the closet, her hands steady as she retrieved her charcoal gray coat. The fabric felt familiar and comforting. As she slid her arms into the sleeves, she caught a glimpse of herself in the ornate hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her was pale and her eyes were wide, but they were also fiercely alive. There was a resolve in her expression that she hadn't seen in a decade. For years, she had seen a ghost in her own reflection, a tired, faded version of herself. Tonight she saw a woman made of flesh and blood and fire. Her car keys were in her coat pocket. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, and the reality of what she was doing solidified. This wasn't a temporary retreat. This wasn't a dramatic exit after which she would circle the block and return, ready to apologize for making a scene. This was an ending. The door to her old life was closing, and she was the one turning the key. She opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the crisp November night. The air was cold and clean, a stark contrast to the stuffy, overheated atmosphere of the party. It filled her lungs, a cleansing breath that seemed to chase out the last vestiges of James's suffocating presence. She pulled the door shut behind her, and the solid, definitive click was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. For a moment, she just stood on the porch, bathed in the soft glow of the gaslights that flanked the door. The distant sound of traffic, the rustle of leaves skittering across the lawn, it all felt brand new, as if her senses had been muted for years and were only now reawakening. There was fear, of course. A deep, primal terror of the unknown churned beneath the surface. Her life, as she knew it, was in that house. Her clothes, her books, her business files, the fragile sense of security she had clung to for so long. She had just walked away from all of it. But the fear was secondary to the overwhelming, intoxicating wave of liberation that washed over her. It was a feeling so potent it made her feel lightheaded. A small, incredulous laugh escaped her lips. She had done it. After years of silent suffering, of convincing herself that this was her lot in life, she had finally spoken. She had not just spoken. She had roared. She walked down the stone path to her car, the crunch of her boots on the gravel the only sound in the quiet night. She unlocked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a second, her hands gripping the steering wheel. The quiet hum of the engine coming to life was a reassuring rumble. She didn't turn on the radio. She didn't want any noise to distract from the beautiful, terrifying, perfect silence of her own thoughts. She pulled away from the curb, her headlights cutting a path through the darkness. She didn't look back at the house, at the warm, golden windows filled with people who had witnessed her humiliation and her rebirth. There was nothing for her there anymore. She drove past the turnoff to the street she shared with James, the home that had become her prison. She kept driving, with no destination in mind, just the forward motion, the feeling of putting distance between who she was and who she had been. Each mile that passed felt like a reclamation, a piece of her soul returning. The road ahead was dark and unknown, but for the first time in a very long time, it was hers to choose. The city lights smeared across Eleanor's windshield, a blur of red and white and gold. She had been driving for nearly an hour, the rhythmic motion of the car a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. The initial wild euphoria of her escape had begun to recede, leaving in its place the cold, stark question. What now? She couldn't drive forever. She needed a safe place to land, a quiet corner where she could begin to process the cataclysmic shift she had just initiated in her life. One name came to mind, a name that felt like a lifeline. Sarah, her best friend from college, a woman whose laughter had once been a daily presence in her life. James had never liked Sarah. He found her too independent and a bad influence, which Eleanor now understood was code for someone who sees me for what I am. Over the years, under James's subtle but persistent pressure, their friendship had been relegated to occasional texts and infrequent lunches, each one followed by a passive-aggressive interrogation from her husband. With trembling fingers, Eleanor navigated to a quiet side street and parked the car. She found Sarah's number in her phone, her thumb hovering over the call button. A wave of doubt washed over her. What would she say? It was late. It was dramatic. But the alternative? A sterile hotel room where she would be alone with the echoing voices of the last decade was unbearable. She pressed the button. Sarah answered on the second ring, her voice warm but groggy. Elle? Is everything okay? It's almost midnight. The sound of her friend's voice, so full of genuine concern, was what finally broke the dam. A single hot tear slid down Eleanor's cheek. Sarah? I'm so sorry to call so late, she whispered, her voice cracking. I left him. I left James. There was no hesitation on the other end of the line. No judgment, no surprise. Just a simple, unwavering statement. Where are you? Come here, now. 20 minutes later, Eleanor was standing on Sarah's doorstep, her small overnight bag clutched in her hand. The door swung open and Sarah was there, her arms open. Eleanor fell into her friend's embrace and the tears she had been holding back finally came, a flood of grief, relief, and terror. Sarah held her, stroking her hair, murmuring words of comfort. "You're safe," she said over and over. "You're safe here." Inside, Sarah's apartment was a haven of soft light and calm. She sat Eleanor down on the plush sofa, wrapped a thick blanket around her shoulders, and pressed a steaming mug of tea into her hands. It was as she was recounting the story, the words tumbling out of her in a raw, uncensored stream, that her phone began to buzz incessantly on the coffee table. It was James. The screen lit up with his name, followed by a rapid-fire succession of texts. "Where the hell are you? You think you can just walk out? After everything I've given you? You made a complete fool of me, Eleanor. A fool. You have 5 minutes to get back here before I do something you'll regret." Then, his tone shifted. The rage was replaced by a cloying, manipulative concern. "Are you okay? I'm worried sick. Please just tell me you're safe. Elle, honey, we can talk about this. You were just emotional. We were all drinking. Let's not throw everything away. I love you. Don't you know that? I just want you to come home." Eleanor stared at the screen, her blood running cold. It was the same cycle she had lived through for years, condensed into a series of text messages. The rage, the threats, the blame, followed by the saccharine, hollow declarations of love. It was all a performance, a desperate attempt to pull her back into his control. Sarah picked up the phone, her expression hardening as she read the messages. "What a monster," she said, her voice laced with disgust. "Classic narcissist playbook. He's not worried about you, Elle. He's worried about losing his punching bag." Looking at the phone, at the name on the screen that had once made her heart flutter and now only filled her with dread, Eleanor knew what she had to do. The fear was still there, a ghost whispering in her ear, but her resolve was stronger. She took the phone from Sarah's hand, her fingers surprisingly steady. She navigated to his contact, her thumb hovering over the option she had never dared to consider. "You can't grow anything without light and air," she whispered to herself, repeating the words that had set her free. Then she pressed block. The immediate silence from the phone was profound. It was a small digital action, but it felt like slamming a 2-ton steel door. There was no going back. She had cut the cord. A wave of exhaustion, so deep it was bone-wearying, washed over her. But underneath it was a quiet, steady hum of power. She had survived the party. She had survived the escape. And she had just survived his first attempt to pull her back. She looked at Sarah, a real, true smile touching her lips for the first time that night. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice raspy but firm. "Can I have some more of that tea?" 3 months later, the sun streamed into Eleanor's new apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, glittering promises. It was a small space, nothing like the grand hollow house she had shared with James, but it was entirely hers. The walls were painted a soft, calming sage green, a color she had once suggested for their old living room and been vetoed on. Her own graphic design prints, vibrant and bold, hung in simple frames. Her navy dress, the one she'd been discouraged from wearing to the party, hung on the back of her bedroom door, a symbol not of defeat, but of her quiet, enduring self. The weeks following her departure had been a tempest. James, after realizing his blocking was not a technical glitch, had tried to reach her through every conceivable channel. He had bombarded Sarah's phone, sent cloying, gaslighting emails to Eleanor's business account, and even shown up unannounced at Sarah's building, buzzing every apartment until the concierge threatened to call the police. He'd left tearful, pleading voicemails for Eleanor's parents, painting himself as the bewildered, heartbroken husband, desperate to save his marriage from his wife's sudden and inexplicable breakdown. Each attempt was a fresh assault, but with Sarah's unwavering support and the guidance of a sharp, no-nonsense divorce lawyer, Eleanor held firm. She learned to see his tactics for what they were, not expressions of love, but frantic attempts to regain control. When his lawyers tried to argue that her business was a marital asset he was entitled to a share of, she provided her lawyer with years of bank statements, showing how he had never invested a single penny, and emails in which he had belittled it as her little hobby. The claim was dropped. She was no longer a flower trying to grow in the desert. She was a fortress, and her walls were holding. Her business, far from suffering, was flourishing. Freed from the constant drain of James's negativity, her creativity surged. She took on new clients, launched a website showcasing her portfolio, and poured her energy into the work that had always been her passion. The income from her little hobby was now paying the rent on her sunny apartment and funding her new life. One crisp Saturday afternoon, on a whim, Eleanor found herself walking through a part of town she hadn't visited in years. She stopped in front of a beautifully restored brick building, a simple, elegant sign above the door reading, "The Hearth." It was Liam's restaurant. For a moment she hesitated, her heart giving a nervous flutter. But it wasn't the old, anxious fear she had known with James. It was something else. Curiosity. She was not there to rekindle a flame, but to close a circle. She stepped inside. The restaurant was warm and inviting, filled with the murmur of happy conversation and the delicious aroma of roasted food. Liam was standing near the kitchen pass, talking to a chef. He looked older, his face etched with the fine lines of hard work and responsibility, but his eyes, when he looked up and saw her, were the same, kind and steady. A slow smile of recognition spread across his face. He excused himself and walked over to her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with genuine surprise and warmth. "Wow, hello." "Hi, Liam," she said, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. "I was in the neighborhood. Your place is beautiful. It's everything you always said you wanted." "It's getting there," he said with a humble shrug, though his pride was evident. I heard you made quite a toast a few months back." News traveled fast in their old circles. Eleanor laughed, a real, unburdened laugh. "I suppose I did. It was long overdue." There was no awkwardness, no unresolved tension. Just two people who had once shared a path, now standing on their own, separate, solid ground. They spoke for a few minutes, a simple, pleasant conversation about their lives. He was married, with a baby on the way, his happiness quiet and profound. Eleanor told him she was starting over, that she was happy. He seemed to understand everything she wasn't saying. "I'm really glad to see you looking so well, Elle," he said as she prepared to leave. "Truly." "You too, Liam," she replied. Walking out of the restaurant and back into the bright afternoon, Eleanor felt the last, lingering ghost of her past dissolve. Her toast at the party had not been about Liam, not really. It had been about acknowledging worth, integrity, and the courage to build something beautiful. Standing there on the precipice of her own new life, she realized she was finally doing the same. She was building her own hearth, a place of warmth and light, brick by brick. Her life was not a grand performance anymore. It was a quiet, steady process of creation. Some days were harder than others, filled with fleeting moments of loneliness or doubt, but she was no longer afraid of the silence. She filled it with music she loved, with calls to Sarah, with the satisfying click of her keyboard as she brought a new design to life. She was planting her own garden, and for the first time, she could see the flowers begin to bloom, vibrant and resilient. She was breathing. She was free.